Hello, welcome to the Objective Epistemology podcast. Today we're going to take a deviation and talk about human rights. Many of you probably figured out that I'm an admirer of Ayn Rand. And in one of my favorite books that she wrote, actually it's a conglomeration of essays from her and other people, in the appendix she wrote an essay basically discussing human rights. And one of the most fascinating things I found about that essay is her observation that humans have rights to actions and not objects themselves. It's kind of a weird way to think about it, but maybe for an example, you have a right to clean your own water, the action of cleaning your own water, but you don't have a right to clean water as an object in itself. The reason is that if you can't clean your own water, and it is a human right to have clean water, then anyone who can clean water will have to become your slave, because if they don't give you clean water or provide you clean water, they'll be infringing on your right to the object clean water. So the founding fathers definitely recognized this in America, and especially in the Constitution and our Bill of Rights, is that we have rights to actions. No one can stop you from cleaning your own water. That would be a violation of a right, but you don't have a right to the object, clean water. Interesting. So today, I'd like to take a look at the United Nations International Bill of Human Rights and try to apply the concept of rights to actions instead of the object itself and see where the International Bill of Human Rights goes wrong. Let's take a look here. Many of these I probably would imagine I would agree with, but some of them, not so much. Let's begin reading this document. Following the Second World War, a series of declarations and covenants began to articulate universal human rights. In 1948, for the first time, countries agreed on a comprehensive list of inalienable human rights. In December of that year, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, a milestone that would profoundly influence the development of international human rights law. In December 1966, the UN General Assembly adopted two international treaties that would further shape international human rights: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These are very often referred to as the international covenants. Let's get started with this. So I'm going to start reading off some of these, and I'll probably just continue reading them until I find ones that are troublesome. Freedom from discrimination. Sounds wonderful. Right to equality between men and women. Absolutely, I'm an individualist. I think all individuals should be equal, or at least treated equally under the law. A right to life. Your life. Here, this is where things get a little weird, because if you have a right to the object life, not the actions of life, that means that if you can't sustain your own life, anyone who can sustain your life, there becomes obligated to sustain your life for you. That can't be a right, because it infringes on other people's rights. Freedom from torture? Totally agree with that. See, right to work? Absolutely. You should have the right to the actions of work, working to provide for yourself and your family, or whoever you choose to. Freedom to choose and accept work? That's great too. Freedom from slavery? Absolutely. Right to just and favorable conditions at work? Sure. A right to liberty and security of person? A right to liberty and security of person. This is where things get a little weird, at least in the way I think about rights. Because if you have the right to liberty, and you can't provide yourself liberty, does that mean everyone else who can becomes your slave? Same with security. If you have a right to security, what do you have to give up to be secure? Because if you can't secure yourself or your own belongings, whose job does that become? Interesting to think about, right? A right to form trade unions. I don't think that could ever be a right. Why would you have to have a right to form trade unions when somebody who owns a business has property rights over that business? See, I don't think I've seen property rights in the same way in this document. So you don't have a right to trade unions. Right to be treated humanely in detention. Agreed. I think that's great. A right to strike. Again, that can't be a right. Why would you be able to strike? Couldn't somebody that owned the business decide that they didn't want you working there anymore? If you're not going to do the job and they need someone to do the job, that's part of work. Because if you own the business, then you call the shots when it comes to who works there and who doesn't work there. I don't think that the United Nations is very interested in property rights. I have a feeling that they're very Marxist. Freedom of movement. Movement where? Across borders? That's not how governments work. And if there's freedom of movement in your own country, absolutely. If there's freedom of movement around the world, respecting other countries' border laws and their other regulations and laws, yeah, why not? But freedom of movement to cross borders illegally, it's never good for a country. It's unsustainable. I hate that word now, but I'm using it in the proper terminology. A right to social security. So they're basically saying that you have a right to basic needs. Like, at whose expense? Why does somebody else have to pay for your security if you can't provide for it yourself? Right of mothers to special protection before and after birth. Don't know what that means. It says something about no arbitrary expulsion from a country, I believe. Country doesn't want you there. There's probably a reason. I guess if they're saying it's arbitrary to who? They have to give you a reason? Maybe. I could entertain that idea. So no economic exploitation. That sounds fucking Marxist. I don't like that at all. What does economic exploitation even mean? I'd need some clarification on that because I don't think that could ever be a right. A right to fair trial. Absolutely. Right to recognition before the law. Absolutely. A right to adequate standards of living. Uh-oh. What does that mean? So if you live somewhere in the standards, whose standard? By what standard? If the standards are not up to par based on what? Then somebody else has to pay for your living standards to be raised? How could that be a right? Because if everyone's standard of living is low and no one can afford to raise it, whose job or does it become to raise your standard of living? And by what means? Are you supposed to enslave them and demand that they work to raise your standard of living? See, that's where contradictions happen in rights. That won't work. Freedom from hunger. Again, if no one has food, who's to produce food when there's no food to be had? Or if somebody works their ass off to make food and grow food or hunt food, and then other people don't have the food, why would they have a right to your labor and time? When I think of labor and time, I think of it as life energy that you spent, which is in limited quantity, on actions to provide for yourself. If other people don't do that or can't do that, why do they get part of your life energy to sustain themselves from hunger? Can't be a right. It's contradiction in terms. A right to health. Again, at whose expense? How can you have somebody like a doctor have to give you free health care because you can't afford it? Or why is it okay to take some people's money to pay for the health care of other people? Again, it's that life energy. So you have a limited quantity of life energy put into being productive. And so if other people can't be productive or they're not productive enough to supply enough health for themselves or health care for themselves, why do they automatically have a right to your productivity? They never talk about that. Freedom of religion and belief. Absolutely. A right to education. Do we have a right to education? We have a right to the actions of being educated. We have a right to educate ourselves, but we don't have a right to education as an object, because if we can't provide it for ourselves, then why do we have a right to other people's labor? Why do we get to enslave them or take from them to not have our rights violated? It's contradiction in terms again. Can't be a right. Freedom of expression. See, this is a weird one because I feel like they're trying to say freedom of speech here. And obviously freedom of speech is one of the most profound and important freedoms recognized anywhere of all time. But I don't know why they would use the word expression other than they don't like the idea of free speech. I don't think that they want that, because if they were to have created this document, there's many countries that don't allow free speech. And even in America today, if you hadn't noticed, all of the censorship on free speech is coming to fruition again. It's scary, unacceptable. Freedom of parents to choose schooling for their children. You could have the freedom of parents to choose schooling for their children without anyone getting in their way. That's one thing, but I don't know that the way that they're writing this, based on all the other rights that they've put up here, that that's what they're actually meaning. So there's a difference. A right to peaceful assembly. Absolutely. Freedom of association. Absolutely. A right to take part in cultural life. Don't know what that actually means, but if you have the right to the actions of going into society and living your life, that's fine. If you have a right to take part in cultural life and you can't do it, does that mean other people have to provide it for you? That can't be a right. That's another contradiction. Right to marry and found a family. Great, wonderful. Right to enjoy benefits of science. Absolutely. Right of authors to moral and material interests from works. Is that copyright? I'm trying to figure out what they actually mean by that. Right of authors to moral and material interest from work. I don't like how that's written. I don't know exactly what they mean by that. If they mean copyright, that means that when you produce something, you have the right to own it, or at least own the actions that are going to be surrounding the thing that you created. That works for me. But I don't think that that's what they mean here. Freedom to undertake scientific research and creative activities. Absolutely wonderful. Right of children to birth, registration, and a nationality. That's a weird way of putting that. If they mean that you have a right to register as a national of a country that you're born in, I'll go with that, I guess. I might want to reword that and have a conversation. Right to participate in public affairs. Again, you have the right of action to participate in public affairs, but you don't have a right to the object, because if you can't provide participation, you can't provide the actions necessary for participation. Does that mean other people become required to do that for you? That wouldn't be a right. That would be a contradiction. Right to equality before the law. Always. Wonderful. Minority rights. No, individuals have rights. The individual is the smallest minority and the most persecuted minority. I think that that's a contradiction. I don't think that minorities as a group can have rights that are above and beyond the individual's rights. Another contradiction. Who came up with this shit? So I think that's generally what they have on this website here. There's a couple different versions of this. But I noticed that they never said you have the right to free speech. I don't think some of the countries like that. I think that that's very, very troublesome when it comes to the United Nations. I don't think they have the individual's best interest in mind. I think this is a collectivist organization, and I don't like it. I don't like what they stand for. I also noticed that they didn't say anything about the right to bear arms, because when you can bear arms, that means that you're capable of defending yourself against tyranny. If you hadn't noticed, the United Nations recently has been very interested in the World Economic Forum, a lot of this social justice, woke Marxist bullshit, and they don't like the idea that a citizenry can decide that they don't want it anymore and that they won't be forced or subjugated to participate. So anyway, this will be a little shorter episode. I have another one coming up. It'll probably be a little longer. Thank you for listening, and this was episode 4 of the Objective Epistemology Podcast.